Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In previous lectures, we've talked about the challenges that confronted the Diem regime, and with John F. Kennedy and his presidency. In the last lecture, we talked in particular about the struggles of the Strategic Hamlet Program. In this lecture, our final lecture regarding the Kennedy presidency and Diem, we'll talk about the demise of the Diem regime and the final months of JFK's life and presidency. The problems and issues that had been simmering for many months exposed to the surface during the Battle of Apec in January of 1963. In this battle, only a few hundred VC troops, about 350, were dug into a trench near the village of Apec on the edge of the Plain of Reeds, 40 miles southwest of Saigon. The ARVN, learning of these troops from American intelligence, sent more than 2,000 troops to surround the emplacement. The plan was to flush the Viet Cong out of their position into the open fields where air support could cut them down. But the Viet Cong didn't flee their positions. With small arms, they shot down 5 helicopters and damaged 9 more, killing many men inside. The ARVN troops hesitated and refused to attack. Officers hesitated in making orders, and the Viet Cong ultimately escaped from the much larger attacking force. There were 12 VC killed in the battle, but more than 61 killed and more than 100 wounded ARVN troops, and 3 dead Americans. The Battle of Apec set off a string of negative reports, which the government dismissed or denied. But the negative trend only accelerated in 1963. While it's still very early, historians look back at this and recognize the growing trend toward what would be called the credibility gap. This was the void between reality and the truth in the field of what was going on in Vietnam and what was being reported to the American people. And while the phrase itself really didn't come into use for several more years, this is just an early example, the Battle of Apec, in which reports coming from the government really didn't line up with what was happening in the field. In the midst of this, the Diem government was deteriorating, its paranoia and bizarre behaviors increasing. Wo Dinh Nhu's secret police and the stormtroopers controlled by Madame Nhu launched many attacks against the citizens. In the meantime, members of Diem's family and inner circle enriched themselves with gambling rings and opium. Diem himself grew more and more secluded. He was working 18-hour days, but rarely left his bedroom. To outsiders, it was clear. South Vietnam was a dictatorship. Dissidents were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. Elections were manipulated. The press, radio, and television were controlled. On October 26, 1962, Diem staged a massive parade in honor of the so-called elections of 1955 that put him in power. It was a bizarre spectacle. For months in advance, Diem called in his ARVN troops to train for the parade. Then, on the day of the parade, the troops completely sealed off the parade route to the public. The parade wound through Saigon, but with no spectators. Diem was terrified of being exposed to the people. As journalist David Halberstam described it, one felt as if he were watching a movie company filming a scene about an imaginary country. It was the Buddhist crisis in the summer of 1963 that finally did end the Diem government. The Buddhists had long resented Diem for his policies, which awarded land, power, and jobs to his Catholic supporters, often at the expense of Buddhists and others. Buddhists were part of a vast population in South Vietnam frustrated with Diem, and they protested, along with many others. They took special prominence on May 8, 1963, when Diem prevented the Buddhists from flying their religious flags during one of their holiday festivals. Buddhist protesters gathered in Hue and ARVN troops opened fire on the protesters, killing 8 and wounding dozens more. In response to that attack, Buddhists began more extensive protest. There were marches, more than 10,000 strong. Some of them engaged in hunger strikes. These protesters were routinely attacked themselves. During this state of near war, on June 11, 1963, a Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc knelt in a Saigon street and with the help of supporters doused himself in gasoline and burned himself. Several other such acts followed over the next few days, to which Madame News said she would, quote, provide the gasoline for the next barbecue. The American ambassador to Vietnam, Frederick Nolting, pleaded with Diem to reach some compromise, but he refused, only escalating the attacks against the Buddhists. New and his secret police extended the attack into the countryside, surrounding Buddhist pagodas with barbed wire and canceling all meetings. Buddhists were killed or arrested, including many children. On August 20th, 1963, Diem imposed martial law on the whole country. In the United States, such attacks prompted intense debate. In August 1963, Kennedy replaced Frederick Nolting with U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., an esteemed senator from Massachusetts and former ambassador to the UN. But Lodge was unable to see an answer to the problem. The only alternative was the unattractive idea of supporting a coup against Diem. On August 28th, he cabled back to Kennedy. Quote, the United States is launched on a course from which there is no respectable turning back, the overthrow of the Diem government. There is no possibility that the war can be won under a Diem administration. The chance of bringing off a general's coup depends on them to some extent. We should proceed to make an all-out effort to get the generals to move promptly. Lodge began to distance himself from Diem and New, who began to suspect that a coup might be coming. Diem grew even more paranoid, calling all ARVN troops back to Saigon for his personal protection. In the countryside, this set off a near frenzy at many of the strategic hamlets, where Viet Cong cut loose the barbed wire and freed the peasants. Many of these peasants joined their ranks, and the barbed wire was used in making landmines. On November 1st, 1963, Diem and New realized that they were doomed. They decided to surrender. They were picked up at the palace by members of their own personal security staff and generals, and driven by truck to the Joint General Staff headquarters. When they arrived there, they were dead. They had been shot. Other members of the Diem government were driven into exile or killed. Madame New survived, as she was in the United States at the time. JFK was profoundly disappointed at the news. His government had spent over $1 billion in South Vietnam, increased the number of advisors to more than 16,000, and had seen 108 Americans killed there. But the Viet Cong were stronger than ever. Kennedy requested still more information and sent advisors to observe the situation. Only a few days before he was killed, he said, I even want to think about whether or not we should be there. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated, and such thoughts would never be realized. Lyndon Baines Johnson then became president, and the United States slipped even further into the Vietnam quagmire.